The fire has burned low, the way fires do this time of night, and if you're listening to this in bed with the lights already off, then you are exactly where this story wants you. Settle in. There is nothing urgent here, nothing that needs your full attention. Just a voice and a question that has been sitting quietly in the human story for longer than anyone realized. Here is the question, and here is what is actually at stake in it. We have always assumed that somewhere in our past, before electric light and alarm clocks and glowing screens, human beings slept the way we imagine sleep is supposed to happen. Long, deep. 9 hours, 10 hours stretched out under open sky with nothing to disturb it. We have told ourselves that modern life stole something from us, some ancient birthright of rest, and that if we could only strip away the noise of the present, we would fall back into that older, gentler rhythm. A team of scientists set out not long ago to finally test whether that story was true. What they found unsettled almost everything we thought we understood about how our species learned to close its eyes at night. In the late summer of 2013, an anthropologist named Gandhi Yatish walks into a small clearing in eastern Bolivia, where a group of Tsimana families are finishing the day's work by the last orange light. He is carrying a case of instruments that look almost like ordinary wristwatches, small enough to fit in his palm, and for the next several months he will ask people here and later in Tanzania, and later still in Namibia, to simply wear one while they live their lives exactly as they always have. No electricity, no clocks, no sense really of what time even means in the way a city dweller understands it. An older man in the village turns the device over in his hands, curious, a little amused, before agreeing to strap it to his wrist for the night. He has never heard the word insomnia. His language does not have one. He assumes, like everyone watching this unfold, that the little machine will simply confirm what science has always suspected, that people who live close to the land sleep long and sleep well the way nature intended. That is not what the data shows. When the numbers finally come back from 3 different continents, from 3 different peoples, who have never met one another, and share almost nothing in common, except a way of life untouched by the industry, the pattern is nearly identical, and it is nowhere close to the long unbroken rest we had imagined. These are people with no artificial light, no caffeine, no meetings to rush to in the morning, and still, night after night, their bodies choose something shorter, something stranger, something that looks almost uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever glanced at the clock at 2 in the morning and wondered if something is wrong with them. It raises a question that reaches back much further than these 3 communities, back across tens of thousands of years into the deep original nights of our species, long before fire was tamed and long before anyone built a wall to sleep behind. If the last people on Earth still living something close to our ancestral pattern are not sleeping the long, easy sleep, we assumed then what was actually happening in those early nights. What did the body know back then that we may have quietly forgotten? That is where this story is going tonight, into the true and surprisingly recent science of how early humans actually rested. Why a shorter, more fractured kind of sleep may not be a modern failure at all, but something closer to an old inheritance carried forward from a time when closing your eyes completely was not always safe to do. Scholars still debate exactly how far back this pattern extends, and there is real disagreement about which piece of the puzzle matters most, whether it is temperature or vigilance or the shape of the human brain itself. But the evidence that does exist tells a quieter, more human story than the one we usually tell ourselves about the past, and it begins somewhere you would not expect, not in a laboratory, but in the space between a dying fire and the first hint of morning. Before we go further into that story, if this is the kind of history you come back for, the quiet kind, the true kind, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach more people who might need something calm to listen to at the end of their day. And if you have a moment, leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular question. I read every one, and I always find it a little remarkable, imagining all the different rooms in all the different time zones where this same story is quietly playing. For now, get comfortable, turn the lights down if you have not already, and let's go back further than Bolivia, further than any village or any wristwatch, to the very first nights our species ever spent trying to survive the dark. Because long before anyone measured a single hour of sleep with an instrument, human beings were already making a nightly bargain with their own vulnerability. One that shaped not just how long we rest, but why rest looks the way it does in every one of us right down to tonight. The bargain begins, as most true things do, with something small. A body lying down in the dark and a mind that cannot fully let go of the world around it. Picture a woman somewhere on the open grassland of what is now northern Tanzania, perhaps 90,000 years ago, long before anyone would think to call this era anything at all. She has spent the day walking, digging, carrying, watching the horizon, the way everyone in her group learns to watch it without even noticing they are doing it. Night falls quickly this close to the equator the way it always does, without the long, lingering dusk that people further north experience. There is a fire nearby, small and carefully fed, and there are other bodies around her close enough to touch, close enough to hear breathing. Change as it slows into sleep. She lies down. But she does not disappear the way we imagine sleep working today, a full and total absence from the world. Some part of her stays tuned to the dark beyond the firelight the way a string stays taut even when the instrument is not being played. This is not insomnia, this is not a flaw in her biology. This, as far as the evidence can tell us, is simply what a human night looked like for most of the time our species has existed. It is easy from where we sit now, warm and enclosed and largely safe from anything that might want to eat us, to forget how recent our safety actually is. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, closing your eyes completely for hours at a stretch in an open or lightly sheltered space was not a neutral act. It was a risk weighed nightly whether anyone consciously thought of it that way or not. Lions do not observe visiting hours. Neither do hyenas nor leopards, nor the dozens of smaller dangers that a body loses the ability to notice the moment it drops into deep, slow wave sleep. Evolution does not reward the animal that sleeps the most soundly. It rewards the one that survives long enough to wake up again. This is where the shape of early human sleep starts to make a different kind of sense, one that has nothing to do with weakness or deprivation, and everything to do with a very old, very practical arithmetic. Anthropologists who have spent time with communities living close to this ancestral pattern have documented something quietly remarkable, something that rarely makes it into the popular imagination of caveman life. Sleep in these settings is rarely a private individual act. It is communal, staggered and porous. People drift off at different times, people wake at different times, someone is almost always in some low-level way half aware of the fire, the wind, the shifting of bodies nearby. The research remains genuinely incomplete on exactly how far back this pattern extends, and scholars still debate whether it reflects a deliberate strategy or simply an emergent property of how humans sleep when they are packed closely together without walls to separate them. But the pattern itself, once you notice it, is hard to unsee. It looks less like 9 individuals each having their own private unconsciousness, and more like a single living watch rotation, one that nobody had to be assigned to because the biology itself seems to arrange it. There is a piece of research that captures this in a way that still surprises people the first time they hear it. An anthropologist named Polly Wiesner, who spent decades among the Juhoanzi San of the Kalahari, noticed something odd about the stories being told after dark compared to the stories told during the day. In daylight, conversation tends to be practical, sometimes sharp, focused on economics disputes, who owes what to whom. But once the sun goes down and the fire is lit, the entire emotional register of the group shifts. The talk turns toward myth, toward distant relatives, toward the kind of storytelling that builds and repairs the social fabric holding a small group together in a large indifferent landscape. People stay awake for this. They choose it even though the workday has already exhausted them, even though sleep is right there waiting. It suggests something we rarely give our ancestors credit for, that's staying up past the point of pure necessity, gathering close to a shared flame, talking through the things that matter before finally giving in to rest. Maybe one of the oldest human habits we still in some quieter form carry with us tonight. None of this would have been possible without fire itself, and the story of how fire entered the human night is older and stranger than most people assume. At a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, researchers have found burned bone fragments and ash layers dating back roughly 1 million years, among the earliest solid evidence anywhere in the world of a hominin species deliberately controlling flame. 1 million years is a difficult number to hold in the mind. It means that long before our own species, Homo sapiens, had even emerged, some ancestor of ours, likely Homo erectus, was already doing something that would permanently reshape the architecture of the human night. Fire did not just provide warmth, it pushed back the edge of the dark, however slightly, and in doing so it changed the calculation every sleeping body was quietly running. A little more light meant a little less need for constant vigilance. A little less need for vigilance may have meant over the span of hundreds of thousands of years room for sleep itself to shift, to lengthen, in places to soften at its edges. But it would be a mistake to imagine this as the single clean turning point, one where humans discovered fire and immediately began sleeping the long untroubled way we picture today. The evidence suggests something far more gradual and far more human than that. A slow renegotiation stretched across an almost incomprehensible span of time. At another site, Gesher Benut Yaakov, in what is now northern Israel, archaeologists have found evidence of recurring, controlled fire used dating back roughly 790,000 years hearths that appear to have been used again and again in the same spot, suggesting not an occasional accident of nature, but a habit, a practice, something closer to a ritual than an emergency measure. Fire, in other words, became part of the architecture of daily and nightly life, long before anyone was building the kind of permanent shelter we associate with safety. For an enormous stretch of that time, the fire was the wall, the fire was the door that could be locked, and the people sleeping near it were still making the same nightly bargain their ancestors always had, just with slightly better odds. What is easy to miss? Listening to this from the comfort of a locked door and a climate-controlled room is how much of what we now call an ordinary night was once a small, quiet feat of cooperation. Someone tends the fire, someone half listens for the wrong kind of silence in the grass. Children sleep in the middle of the group, not at its edges. A pattern still observed today among people living close to this ancestral rhythm, one so consistent across unrelated cultures that it hints at something instinctive rather than taught. The body seems to know even now, even in a bedroom on the 14th floor of a building with a locked door, and no predator for 1,000 miles, that sleeping at the center of a group once meant something. Old patterns do not disappear simply because the danger that shaped them has. They just go quiet, waiting in the body for a world that mostly no longer exists. And so a strange thought settles in the middle of all this. The 8 hours of solid, private, uninterrupted sleep that so many of us treat as the biological gold standard, the thing we are failing to achieve every time we wake at 3 in the morning and stare at the ceiling, may never have been the ancestral default at all. It may be closer to the exception, a relatively recent, relatively fragile invention made possible by walls, by locks, by electric light, by a level of safety our species has enjoyed for only a sliver of its existence. What our early ancestors seem to have practiced instead was something more flexible, more communal, more responsive to the actual conditions of the dark around them. Not worse sleep, different sleep, built for a different kind of night than the one most of us now live in. There is one more piece of this early picture worth sitting with before the story moves forward, something that has less to do with predators or fire, and more to do with the body's own internal clock and with the discovery that would eventually turn everything we thought we understood about ancient rest quietly upside down. There is a particular kind of cold that settles over open ground in the hour before dawn, the deepest, quietest cold of the whole night arriving. Not when the sun disappears, but hours after, once the earth itself has finished giving up the last of the day's heat. Anyone who has camped without walls around them knows this moment, the one where you pull whatever you have closer around your shoulders without quite waking up enough to remember doing it. It turns out this small, half-conscious gesture may be one of the oldest and most reliable alarm clocks the human body has ever owned, far older and far more trustworthy than the rising or setting of the sun itself. For a long time, the assumption among sleep researchers was a simple one. So simple it barely seemed worth questioning. Darkness falls humans sleep. Light returns humans wake. It fit neatly with everything we thought we understood about a species evolved beneath an unbroken cycle of day and night, and it matched the tidy diagrams found in almost every textbook on the subject. But when Jerome Siegel and his colleagues sat down with the data collected from the Hadza, the San, and the Siman, the small wrist devices tracking every flicker of light and every twitch of movement across more than 1,000 recorded nights, the sunset theory did not hold up, not even close. Across all three groups, on average, people did not lie down to sleep the moment. Darkness fell, they stayed awake, gathered near their fires for a little over 3 hours after sunset, before finally settling in. 3 hours is not a small discrepancy. It is the better part of an entire evening, spent wide awake in the dark, doing exactly what the story from earlier suggested, talking, tending flame, existing together in the last hours before rest. So if it was not the disappearance of light pulling these bodies towards sleep, something else had to be doing the work. And the answer the data pointed toward turned out to be something almost nobody had seriously considered before: something quieter and more physical than light: temperature. Across every night, recorded in that study sleep onset lined up with striking consistency to the period when the ambient temperature had begun its steepest overnight decline. The hours when the day's stored heat is finally bleeding out of the ground and into the open air, and waking in turn lined up closely with the coldest point of the night, the low just before temperatures begin climbing again with the first hint of morning. The body, it seems, is not simply responding to the presence or absence of light. It is tracking something closer to the actual physics of the environment around it, the falling and rising curve of temperature that light merely happens to correlate with most of the time in most places. Scholars still debate how much weight to give temperature relative to other cues the body may be using at the same time, and the evidence on this point remains genuinely incomplete, since isolating one environmental signal from another in a naturalistic setting is extraordinarily difficult to do with certainty. But the correlation Siegel's team documented was strong enough and consistent enough across 3 unrelated cultures on the 3 different continents that it reshaped how many researchers think about what sleep actually evolved to respond to in the first place. There is a reason this makes a kind of quiet biological sense once you sit with it. A cooling core body temperature is one of the physiological hallmarks of the transition into sleep in nearly every study of human physiology, industrial or otherwise. Falling ambient temperature outside the body may simply be nudging that internal process along, working with it rather than against it in a way that daylight, oddly enough, cannot. Light can be blocked by a cave wall, a heavy cloud, a dense canopy of leaves. Temperature dropping slowly and steadily across the hours of night is a far more difficult signal to hide from, which may be exactly why a body shaped by hundreds of thousands of years without walls or curtains would come to lean on it so heavily. This idea that something other than the visible sun might be steering the human clock is not entirely new, and its earlier chapter belongs to one of the strangest personal experiments in the history of science, one that has nothing to do with hunter-gatherers at all. In the summer of 1962, a French geologist named Michel Siffre climbed down into a glacier cave beneath the Alps intending to study the ice formations below. Almost on impulse, he decided to stay alone. Without a clock, without any way of knowing whether it was day or night on the surface far above him for 2 months straight. He kept a rough log of when he woke and slept and ate, calling up to his support team on the surface each time he believed a new day had begun, so they could record the actual date without ever telling him what it was. What happened to his sense of time is the part of the story that still unsettles people who hear it for the first time. Cut off from sunlight entirely, Siffre's internal clock did not collapse into chaos the way you might expect. It kept running steady and rhythmic, but it drifted slowly, stretching toward a day that was no longer exactly 24 hours long. By the time he climbed back into daylight, he was convinced only about a month had passed. It had been closer to 2. Siffre's experiment and the many cave and bunker studies that followed it over the following decades proved something quietly profound about the human body, something that connects directly back to the fires and the falling temperatures of that much older, much longer night in our species' past. The rhythm of sleeping and waking does not come from outside us. It is not simply imposed by the sun rising and setting overhead. It comes from within an internal clock, biological and self-sustaining, that the outside world merely nudges into alignment day after day. Left with nothing to nudge it, that inner clock does not vanish. It simply drifts following its own quiet logic, waiting for a cue strong enough to pull it back into step with the world above. For our early ancestors, sleeping in open or lightly sheltered spaces across the plains and woodlands of a young human world, that cue was very rarely the sun disappearing over the horizon. It was almost certainly the slow physical cooling of the air itself, arriving reliably every single night regardless of cloud cover, canopy, or the particular slope of a hillside, a signal the body could trust in a way it perhaps could not always trust its own eyes. And this reframes something that might otherwise sound like a small dry detail from a research paper into something closer to an old and intimate truth. The chill that used to make an ancestor draw closer to the fire, the one that still today makes any one of us reach half asleep for an extra blanket in the coldest hour before dawn, may be one of the most ancient and unbroken threads connecting the way we sleep now to the way sleep first took shape in our species, tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to measure it. None of this fully explains on its own why these ancestral sleep periods run shorter than the 8 or 9 hours so often held up as the ideal. Temperature can explain when sleep begins and when it ends far more convincingly than it explains why the window between those 2 points is not longer than it is. That question pulls the story in a slightly different direction away from physics and back towards something more social, more strategic, something that has less to do with the cooling of the air and more to do with what a human body loses and gains by giving up full awareness of its surroundings for hours at a stretch. It is a question that becomes even sharper once you start looking closely at exactly how deeply and how completely these traditional sleepers actually let themselves go under each night, and what the record suggests some of them may have been doing instead of sleeping at all during those long, quiet hours after the fire had burned down to embers. The strangest discoveries in sleep science rarely come from watching people sleep somewhere exotic. Sometimes they come from watching people fail to sleep somewhere perfectly ordinary in a room with a comfortable bed, a locked door, and absolutely nothing wrong except the simple fact that it's unfamiliar. In 1966, a small group of researchers brought volunteers into a sleep laboratory for what should have been a routine study, wiring their scalps with electrodes to record the electrical rhythms of the brain across a full night's rest. What they noticed almost by accident was something nobody had been specifically looking for. On the first night in an unfamiliar bed, one half of a person's brain consistently slept less deeply than the other. not by a small margin either. The left hemisphere in most of the volunteers studied showed clear signs of lighter, more easily disturbed sleep, more responsive to outside sound, quicker to stir toward waking, while the right hemisphere settled into its normal deep rhythm, largely undisturbed. By the second night in the same room, the asymmetry had mostly vanished, and both halves of the brain rested the way they were supposed to, evenly together. Researchers eventually gave this phenomenon a name, the first night effect, and for decades it was treated as little more than a curious footnote, an oddity of human sleep with no obvious explanation attached to it. It took a very different field of research, one focused on birds and marine mammals, to suggest what that footnote might actually be pointing toward. Certain species of duck, when sleeping at the edge of a group with open water and open sky, on one exposed side are able to keep one eye open and one half of their brain measurably more alert than the other, watching the direction from which danger is most likely to come, while the opposite hemisphere rests normally. Dolphins do something even more extreme, never fully closing both halves of the brain to sleep at once across their entire lives. A necessity born from the fact that a fully unconscious dolphin would simply stop breathing and drown. Scientists call this unihemispheric sleep, and for a long time it was assumed to belong entirely to the animal kingdom, a specialized adaptation far removed from anything a human brain would ever need to do. The first night effect suggested otherwise. It suggested that buried somewhere in human neurology is a faint muted echo of the exact same strategy, a built-in capacity to keep part of the mind on watch when the surrounding environment cannot yet be trusted, even if that capacity shows up in us as only a fraction of what a mallard or a bottlenose dolphin can do. Sit with that for a moment, because it reframes something that might otherwise sound like nothing more than a minor quirk of modern hotel stays and unfamiliar guest rooms. If a human brain still knows how to keep one hemisphere lightly on guard the very first time it finds itself somewhere new, what does that suggest about every single night our ancestors spent exactly that way, sleeping in a slightly different clearing, beside a slightly different bend in the river, never quite certain the ground beneath them was the same ground it had been the night before? For the overwhelming span of our species' existence, nearly every night may have carried at least a little of that first night quality, that low hum of unfamiliarity the brain has never fully learned to ignore. The researchers who study this today are careful not to overstate the connection, and the evidence remains genuinely incomplete on exactly how directly the first night effect descends from an ancient vigilance system, rather than some more general response to novelty itself. But the shape of the pattern is difficult to dismiss entirely. A brain that still thousands of generations after the last time survival truly depended on it keeps one hand faintly on the door each time it finds itself somewhere it has not yet learned to call safe. This idea of a mind that never fully lets go connects to something else. The Hadza-san and Simane data revealed a detail easy to miss inside all the numbers about hours and minutes, but genuinely surprising once it is placed beside what most people assume about traditional life. These groups, despite sleeping fewer hours overall than we tend to imagine, showed almost no daytime napping. Not the long midday rest that popular imagination often assigns to life in hot climates, not any regular pattern of catching up on lost hours once the sun was high. A short doze here and there occasionally, but nothing resembling a second sleep folded into the middle of the day. It runs against a fairly common assumption, the idea that people living close to nature must simply be sleep-deprived by our standards and quietly making up the difference whenever they can. The data does not support that story. These were not exhausted people limping through their days on borrowed rest. By every measure researchers could apply, they were simply people whose bodies had settled into a shorter, more efficient nightly rhythm, one that did not appear to be costing them the daytime alertness. A modern sleep-deprived office worker would expect to lose under the same hourly total Why the body would be capable of that running efficiently on what looks by contemporary medical guidelines like a chronic sleep deficit remains one of the more genuinely debated questions in the field. Some researchers point to sleep efficiency itself as the answer, the idea that quality may matter as much as quantity, and that a shorter night spent almost entirely in useful restorative sleep stages, with very little tossing, waking, or lying in frustrated wakefulness, may simply accomplish more per hour than a longer night interrupted by the scattered distractions of modern life. Glowing screens, temperature-controlled rooms that never quite mimic the natural cooling of open-air streets that are never fully silent. Other scholars are more cautious, noting that a single set of studies across 3 communities, however, well documented, cannot settle a question this old on its own, and that mainstream sleep science continues to regard 8 hours as a reasonable general guideline for most adults living in industrialized conditions, even if that number was never necessarily the ancestral standard to begin with. What almost everyone agrees on is smaller and in some ways more interesting than either side of that debate. The human body appears to be remarkably adaptable in how it organizes rest, capable of shifting its architecture to fit the pressures of its environment. Whether that environment is a Bolivian riverbank or a fluorescent lit office building, and it may be a mistake to search for one single correct number of hours at all, as though sleep were a fixed biological constant rather than a living responsive system. There is a harder edge to this story too, one the master guide's spirit of honesty would ask us not to soften more than the truth allows. A body that sleeps lightly, that keeps one hemisphere faintly listening, that resists the pull of full unconsciousness. Even in exhaustion is a body paying a real and constant price for its vigilance. Deep uninterrupted sleep is when the brain performs some of its most essential maintenance, clearing away metabolic waste that accumulates through the waking hours, consolidating memory, restoring the kind of clear-headed function that daylight tasks depend on. A species that never fully surrendered to sleep generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years was making a trade better odds against a predator in exchange for something quietly lost each night in the depths of unconsciousness it never fully reached. It is worth asking what that trade cost across the long arc of human history, not as a source of anxiety, but as a kind of respect and acknowledgement that safety, the kind so many of us now take entirely for granted behind a locked door, is a remarkably new and remarkably precious inheritance, one our bodies have not yet fully caught up to believing in. That gap between the world our nervous systems were built to expect and the world most of us now actually live in is where this story is quietly heading next into the strange and only recently uncovered evidence that even after humans built walls and doors and locks that could genuinely keep the dark outside the shape of the ancestral night, did not disappear all at once. It lingered tucked into ordinary households for far longer than almost anyone alive today would ever guess. The gap between an ancestral night and a modern one did not close in a single leap the way we sometimes imagine it, some clean dividing line where humanity stepped out of the wilderness and into the electric age all at once. For a very long time, right in the middle of European history, in homes with locked doors and glass windows and every outward sign of what we would call civilization, people were still sleeping in a way that would look almost unrecognizable to most of us today. This was not something anyone wrote down as remarkable at the time. It was simply how a night was spent, so ordinary that it barely seemed worth mentioning, which is exactly why it took a historian several years of quiet patient searching to notice it was there at all. His name is Roger Eckhurch, and in the 1990s he was working through an entirely unrelated research project on crime in early modern England, when he kept running across a strange recurring phrase buried in court depositions, personal letters, and old medical texts. Witnesses describing the events of a particular night would casually mention what happened after their first sleep. Not after they woke up, not after a nap, after their first sleep, as though everyone reading the document would understand exactly what that meant without further explanation. At first, Eckhart assumed it was some regional idiom, a quirk of language specific to one town or one century, but the phrase kept appearing over and over across centuries of documents in languages other than English in sources scattered across an enormous stretch of European history. He eventually traced references to segmented sleep back through more than 2,000 documents, spanning locations from Italy to France to England to colonial America, and stretching in time from antiquity through the early 1800s. What he was looking at, it slowly became clear, was not an idiom at all. It was a description of how ordinary people actually slept for the greater part of recorded history before the modern single unbroken night became the assumed default. The pattern Eckhart reconstructed looked something like this. People in pre-industrial households would go to bed not long after dark, often around 9 or 10 in the evening, and fall into what they called their first sleep, lasting roughly 3 or 4 hours. Then somewhere in the deep quiet of the middle of the night they would simply wake. Not in distress, not tossing and worrying about falling back asleep the way so many of us do now when this happens. They would wake calmly, treating it as an entirely normal, expected part of the night, and this waking period, sometimes called the watch, could stretch for an hour or more before the second sleep, the Segunda Donna, quietly took hold and carried them through until morning. What people actually did during that gap between the two sleeps is where the historical record turns from strange to genuinely tender. Some prayed, since the watch was considered by more than one religious writer to be an especially pure and undistracted time for devotion free from the noise and business of daylight. Some lay quietly beside a partner and talked, reviewing the events of the previous day, or planning the one ahead in a mood physicians of the period described as unusually calm and reflective, more honest somehow than daytime conversation tended to be. A French physician named Jacques Guillemot, writing medical advice in the late 1500s, went so far as to recommend the period after first sleep as the best possible time for married couples to conceive children, reasoning that people rest more soundly and perform their duties, as he put it, better after that first stretch of sleep than they do at the exhausted end of a long day. Others simply got up. They tended a low fire, checked on animals, visited a neighbour's window if a lamp happened to be lit, or more prosaically, made use of the chamber pot before returning to bed. None of this was considered insomnia. None of it was treated as a problem in need of solving. It was simply the shape of a night as unremarkable to the people living inside it as our own habit of 8 consecutive hours feels to us now. It is worth pausing here because it would be easy to hear all of this and assume it confirms exactly what earlier parts of this story already suggested about our deep ancestral past. One long continuous thread from the earliest hunter-gatherers straight through to European farmhouses in the 1600s. The truth is more complicated than that, and honesty requires saying so plainly. Scholars still debate how directly segmented sleep in historical Europe connects back to the ancient, temperature-driven patterns described in the deep evolutionary story, or whether it represents something else entirely. A different adaptation shaped by long winter nights at higher latitudes where darkness in December can stretch for 14 or 15 hours, far longer than any single stretch of sleep, however generous, could reasonably fill. Jerome Siegel himself, whose research shaped so much of what we have already explored, has suggested that segmented sleep may be less an echo of our oldest African origins, and more a secondary adaptation that emerged later, once human populations migrated far enough from the equator to encounter nights too long for one continuous sleep period to comfortably cover. If that is correct, then what Eckhart found in the historical record and what the earlier chapters of this story described in Tanzania and Namibia may be two related but distinct chapters in a much longer human experiment with darkness, rather than one single unbroken tradition. The evidence on this particular question remains genuinely unsettled, and it may be that both explanations hold a piece of the truth. Temperature guiding the timing of rest in warmer climates near the equator, and sheer length of winter darkness reshaping that same rest further from it. What is not in question is how completely this pattern disappeared and how recently that disappearance happened. For thousands of years, give or take the watch between first and second sleep was simply part of being human. And then within the span of only a few generations it vanished so thoroughly that by the time 20th century sleep researchers began seriously studying human rest, almost nobody remembered segmented sleep had ever existed at all. E. Kirch found the last clear literary reference to it in an English source from the early 1800s. After that, the phrase and the practice it described simply stop appearing, as though an entire shared understanding of the night had been quietly erased from cultural memory within a single lifetime. The reasons behind that disappearance turn out to be less mysterious than the disappearance itself, and they traced back to a handful of very specific, very human changes that reshaped what darkness even meant. Street lighting is one of the earliest and most underappreciated culprits. In the late 1660s, the newly appointed Lieutenant General of Police in Paris, a man named Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, ordered thousands of lanterns installed across the city's streets, an effort so striking to visitors at the time that Paris earned a reputation as the City of Light more than a century before electricity had anything to do with it. Other European cities followed, gradually pushing back the edge of true darkness that had shaped human night since before recorded history began. Coffee houses spread across the same period, offering a socially acceptable, brightly lit reason to stay up later than candlelight alone had ever comfortably allowed, and to fill the hours that used to belong to the watch with commerce, conversation, and caffeine, instead of quiet prayer or drowsy talk in bed. And then later, industrial work discipline finished what streetlight and coffee had started. Factory labour demanded a single uninterrupted block of rest timed precisely against a whistle or a clock, with no tolerance for a worker who woke naturally in the middle of the night for an hour of quiet reflection before returning to sleep. Late 19th century medical literature increasingly began describing that same natural nighttime waking, once considered ordinary and even spiritually valuable, as a disorder, as insomnia, as something to be treated, medicated, and ideally eliminated altogether, so that a person could be rested, alert, and fully present for the demands of a factory floor at dawn. Is it strange to think that something so many of us now dread the experience of waking abruptly at 2 or 3 in the morning, with the mind suddenly unwantedly alert, might once have been considered not just normal but almost restorative? For centuries that exact experience was met not with anxious calculations about how many hours of sleep remained before an alarm, but with a kind of unhurried acceptance, sometimes even welcomed as the best hour of the whole day for honest conversation or quiet thought. The panic so many people feel today lying awake and staring at a clock doing frantic mental arithmetic about lost sleep may be less a symptom of something broken in the body and more a symptom of something broken in our expectations. A modern belief that any night not spent in one smooth, unbroken block is somehow a failure when, for most of human history, broken was simply how a night was built. There is a strange symmetry worth sitting with here, before this story moves further forward, one that connects the flickering hearths of the earliest human bands directly to the flickering gas lamps of 18th century Paris. In both cases, it was light, however small and however primitive, that first began reshaping how long humans were willing to stay conscious after darkness fell. Fire pushed a small circle of safety into the ancient night, and centuries later, streetlight and coffee house and gas lamp pushed it further still, until eventually there was enough artificial light in the world to fill not just the hours after sunset, but nearly the entire night itself, erasing the quiet watch that had once divided one sleep from another. What began as a slow evolutionary negotiation with darkness became in the space of only 2 or 3 centuries an almost complete human victory over it. And victories, as this story is about to explore, rarely come without a cost that only becomes visible generations later once the thing that was won turns out to have changed something in us far more deeply than anyone at the time ever intended. Something quietly ironic sits at the center of the story of artificial light, one that took the better part of a century for anyone to fully notice. The very glow that promised to make the night safer, more productive, more fully human, turned out to carry its own private cost, one that arrived so gradually most people never connected it back to the lamp burning steadily above their heads. By the closing decades of the 1800s, gas lighting had already stretched the practical day well past sunset across most European and American cities, and Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb, unveiled at his Menlo Park laboratory at the very end of the previous decade, was beginning its long march into ordinary homes. The promise attached to this new light was almost entirely a promise of gain. More working hours, more reading hours, more hours simply to be a fully conscious, fully useful person, no longer surrendering a third of every day to darkness, the way every human generation before had been forced to. Nobody framed electric light as a subtraction from anything. It was pure addition, more life pressed into every 24 hours than had ever before been physically possible. And yet in 1869, a young New York physician named George Beard stood before the American Medical Association and described something he was seeing with growing frequency among his patients. A strange, diffuse exhaustion he did not yet have adequate words for. He eventually settled on a name, neurasthenia, drawn from Greek roots, meaning a weakness of the nerves, and in the years that followed he wrote at length about what he believed was causing it. Beard was careful, and in some ways strikingly modern, in tracing the affliction not to any single cause, but to an accumulation of them: the telegraph and its restless flow of news, the steam railway compressing distance and time, the rising pace of urban commerce, and running through all of it a simple physical fact he kept returning to. People were staying conscious for longer than their nervous systems had ever been asked to manage before. He called it, in the title of his 1881 book, American Nervousness, and he believed, whether entirely correctly or not, that the United States was producing more of this particular exhaustion than any other nation on Earth, precisely because it was embracing this new, illuminated, accelerated version of daily life more eagerly than anywhere else. It would be easy, looking back with the comfort of modern sleep science, to dismiss Beard's diagnosis as a product of its era. A vague catch-all label for symptoms doctors of the time did not yet have better language to describe, and there is real truth in that caution. Scholars of medical history still debate how much of what Beard called neurasthenia reflects a genuine physiological phenomenon tied to changing sleep and light exposure, and how much reflects the anxieties of a rapidly industrializing culture, searching for a name to put on its own unease. But it is worth noticing what Beard's patients were actually describing to him. Fatigue that did not lift with, a kind of mental fog that settled in during the day, complaints that map with uncomfortable precision onto what a modern sleep researcher would recognize instantly as the signature of a population no longer sleeping the way its body's expected to. The mechanism behind that shift would not be fully understood for another century, but its outline is visible even now in Beard's own descriptions if you know what to look for. Light, and specifically light in the blue portion of the visible spectrum, the kind gas lamps produced only faintly but electric bulbs would eventually produce in abundance, acts directly on a small cluster of cells at the back of the human eye that has nothing to do with vision itself. These cells exist for exactly one purpose: to inform the brain's internal clock how much daylight remains in the world outside, and to trigger, once darkness genuinely falls, the release of a hormone called melatonin, the chemical signal that tells the rest of the body it is safe and appropriate to begin winding down. A candle, even dozens of candles, produces nowhere near enough of this particular light to meaningfully disrupt that signal. A gas lamp comes closer. An electric bulb, and later, decades further on a television screen or a phone, held close to the face in the dark, produces more than enough. For the first time in the entire history of the species, human beings were reliably nightly telling their own brains that daylight persisted long after the sun itself had gone down, and the brain having no reason to distrust a signal it had relied on since long before there were brains sophisticated enough to be called human simply believed it. There is something almost tender in imagining George Beard writing by a gaslight himself, late into the night, to finish his chapters on the exhaustion of modern civilization, entirely unaware that the very lamp on his desk was quietly contributing to the affliction he was trying to name. He was not wrong that something had changed. He simply did not yet have the biological vocabulary to say precisely what. That vocabulary would not fully arrive until the 1950s and 60s, when researchers finally identified melatonin itself and began mapping decade by careful decade exactly how light entering the eye reaches all the way into the deepest, oldest machinery of the brain's sleep and wake cycle. Was Beard describing a genuine new disease, or was he simply the first person to put a name to something that had been quietly building since the very first oil lamp was lit in a Roman household, or the first controlled fire was carried into a cave 1,000,000 years before that? Perhaps the honest answer is that there is no clean line between those two possibilities, that what Beard was witnessing was not the birth of a new illness, so much as the slow, compounding arrival of an old imbalance finally reaching a threshold where it could no longer be ignored. Each new form of artificial light, from tended flame to gas mantle to glowing filament, pushed the human night a little further back, gave the body a little more reason to distrust the old reliable signal of falling darkness it had used to time its rest for longer than memory could reach. Edison's bulb did not create this imbalance from nothing. It simply finished a project that had been quietly underway since the first ember was carried past the mouth of a cave tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to wonder what all that borrowed light might eventually cost the body that had learned so long ago to trust the dark. What happened next once electric light stopped being a novelty confined to city streets and wealthy parlours and instead entered nearly every bedroom across the industrialized world is where this story turns from a slow historical drift into something that would eventually reshape entire industries, entire economies, and the sleeping patterns of billions of people who never once thought to ask whether the light beside their bed was quietly rewriting the oldest rhythm the human body had ever known. Once electric light stopped being a curiosity confined to a handful of city blocks and began threading its way into factories, docks, and control rooms, it did something no gas lamp or candle ever could. It made the night usable for serious, sustained human labor, and in doing so it created an entirely new category of person, someone whose entire waking life was scheduled to run directly against the rhythm every human body before them had inherited. Continuous industrial operation, the practice of running a factory or a furnace around the clock rather than letting it go cold and silent after dark, existed in a modest form even before electricity, particularly in iron and steel production, where a blast furnace could not simply be shut down each evening without enormous cost and risk. But it was the arrival of reliable electric lighting, spreading through American and European industry through the final decades of the 1800s and the opening years of the 1900s, that made round-the-clock shift work practical on a mass scale for the first time in human history. Factories that had once gone dark and silent with the setting sun could now run a second shift, and soon a third workers rotating through the hours in a pattern that had no precedent anywhere in the story we have been tracing so far, no ancestral echo in the fires of the Kalahari or the segmented nights of pre-industrial Europe. This was something genuinely new under the sun, or rather genuinely new because the sun no longer had much say in the matter at all. For a long time, the human cost of this arrangement was treated as simply the price of progress, an unavoidable friction of modern industry, rather than a biological problem with a biological explanation. It would take most of a century and a series of very public, very costly disasters before that assumption began to seriously crack. In the early hours of March 1979, in the stretch of night between 4 and 6 in the morning, workers at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania were staffing what is, according to decades of accumulated research on human alertness, one of the most physiologically difficult windows of the entire 24-hour cycle to remain sharply attentive during. A relief valve had stuck open, quietly draining coolant from the reactor core, and the instruments in the control room were through a separate mechanical fault displaying information that made the problem far harder to correctly interpret than it should have been. The operators on duty working through the deepest trough of the human circadian rhythm misread the situation and took corrective action that made it worse rather than better, setting off the most serious commercial nuclear accident in United States history. The subsequent federal investigation gave real, documented weight to the role fatigue and the timing of the shift played in that chain of misjudgment, and it helped push an entire generation of safety researchers to start asking a question that had rarely been asked with any seriousness before. Not simply what went wrong, but when it went wrong, and whether the hour on the clock was itself a hidden variable in disasters that had always been explained away as pure mechanical or human failure. A decade later, in the first minutes past midnight on a spring night off the coast of Alaska, an oil tanker named the Exxon Valdez drifted out of its shipping lane and struck a formation known as Bly Reef, rupturing its hull and releasing roughly 11 million gallons of crude oil into Prince William Sound, in what remains one of the most environmentally devastating maritime accidents ever recorded. The federal investigation that followed found that the ship's third mate, who had taken the helm that night, had slept only in brief broken fragments over the previous day and a half following a punishing loading schedule that left almost no real opportunity for rest. He was by any reasonable clinical standard dangerously fatigued navigating a loaded supertanker through a narrow ice-dotted channel in the deep hours of the night with a mind that had been quietly, systematically deprived of what it needed to function. It would be tempting, and it would also be dishonest, to tell this part of the story as though every famous night shift disaster of the last half-century has been cleanly and scientifically proven to trace back to sleep deprivation, and it is worth pausing here to be careful, because that is not quite what the historical and scientific record actually supports. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986, which occurred at roughly 1 in the morning and is frequently cited alongside 3 Mile Island and the Exxon Valdez, as another entry in this same grim category, is a genuinely more contested case. Operators there had been working an extended shift, and the timing of the accident deep in the night has led many popular accounts, including some respected sleep researchers, to describe fatigue as a significant contributing factor. But scholars and safety investigators who have examined the Chernobyl case closely note that the evidence directly tying operator exhaustion to the specific decision made that night is considerably thinner than it is for 3 Mile Island or the Valdez. Resting more on the suggestive fact of the hour than on documented testimony or clear investigative findings, the official technical reports on Chernobyl focus far more heavily on a deeply flawed reactor design and a badly conceived safety test than on the sleep patterns of the men in the control room, and honest science writing on this subject has increasingly pushed back against treating the fatigue explanation as settled fact. It is a useful reminder in the middle of a story about the body's ancient relationship with darkness that not every dramatic claim about sleep deserves to be believed simply because it fits a compelling narrative. The truth here, as in so much of this larger story, is more careful and more limited than the most quotable version of it. What is not contested, and what researchers across multiple independent fields converged on across the 1980s and 1990s, is the broader pattern sitting beneath these individual cases. Human alertness is not flat across the 24-hour day. It rises and falls in a predictable rhythm, governed by the same internal clock that once told an ancestor beside a dying fire when it was safe to finally surrender to deep sleep, and that rhythm reaches two of its lowest points, one in the deep middle of the night and a smaller one in the early afternoon, regardless of how long a person has actually been awake, or how important the task in front of them happens to be. A body asked to perform delicate high-consequence work during that middle-of-the-night trough is being asked to fight against hundreds of thousands of years of biological programming that expects at that exact hour to be almost entirely unconscious. It is not a moral failing when that fight is lost. It is closer to physics. There is something quietly striking in realizing how directly this connects back to the very first parts of this story, to a woman lying near a fire on the grassland. Tens of thousands of years ago, her body only half surrendering to sleep because full unconsciousness once carried real risk. That ancient careful vigilance was built for a world of predators and darkness. It was never built for a control room or a ship's wheelhouse or the deep hours of a factory night shift. Environments where the danger a fully alert mind is meant to guard against comes not from outside the body, but from a mistake made by the very mind that has been asked to stay sharp long after its oldest programming expected it to rest. Is it any wonder, given how young these environments are in the story of our species, barely more than a century old against a backdrop of hundreds of thousands of years, that the body has not yet fully learned how to meet their demands? The recognition of this gap, once it finally arrived in the decades following 3 Mile Island, did not stay confined to disaster investigations. It began working its way slowly and unevenly into how entire industries thought about scheduling human beings at all, into commercial airline regulations governing how long a pilot could legally remain awake before a flight, into hospital policies rethinking how many consecutive hours a medical resident should reasonably be expected to work without meaningful rest, into a quiet but genuine reconsideration of what it actually means to ask a human nervous system shaped across an almost incomprehensible stretch of evolutionary time by fire and darkness and the falling temperature of an open night, to instead perform its most demanding work at 3 in the morning under fluorescent light. That reconsideration did not happen in a courtroom or a factory floor first. It happened quietly and almost by accident in a small basement sleep laboratory at the University of Chicago, where a professor and one of his graduate students were about to notice something moving beneath a sleeping child's closed eyelids that no one had ever thought to look for before. The mystery that had shaped every part of this story so far, the strange half-wakeful nights of early humans, the segmented rest of medieval households, the fatigue quietly hidden inside industrial disasters, all of it had unfolded for centuries without anyone actually knowing what sleep was physiologically while it was happening. For most of recorded history, sleep was simply assumed to be an absence, a shutting off. The mind switched to some dim, undifferentiated dark, no more active than a lamp with its flame extinguished, waiting only for morning to relight it. That assumption held for thousands of years of careful medical and philosophical thought, right up until one exhausted graduate student working in a borrowed basement room with a piece of broken equipment nobody else wanted happened to be watching his own son's closed eyes a little too closely. The setting for this discovery deserves a moment of its own because it says something quietly meaningful about how much of the history of sleep science has depended not on grand institutions, but on small, almost domestic acts of attention. The scientist responsible for the broader research program was Nathaniel Kleitman, a physiologist at the University of Chicago, who had already spent decades trying to build the first truly rigorous account of what happens in the human body during rest. Work patient and thorough enough that his book on the subject, published in 1939, would remain a standard reference for the field for a generation. Years before any of that, in the summer of 1938, Kleitman had done something almost eccentric in its dedication to the question, descending with a colleague named Bruce Richardson into Mammoth Cave in Kentucky and remaining there for over a month, sealed away from any trace of natural light or the ordinary rhythm of day and night, in an attempt to see whether the human sleep cycle could be deliberately stretched to something other than 24 hours. It could to a degree, though imperfectly and with real strain on both men. The experiment offered an early hard-won hint of the same truth. Michel Siffre's Glacier Cave would confirm decades later that the human clock is internal resilient and only loosely tethered to the world outside. It was one of Kleitman's students, a young researcher named Eugene Aserinsky, who would go on to make the discovery that finally cracked sleep open and revealed it to be something far stranger and more structured than anyone had assumed. In the early 1950s, working with old half-functioning recording equipment he had more or less rescued from storage, Aserinsky began observing infants as they slept initially, trying to track the simple behavioral signs of a child drifting off. Almost by accident, he noticed something that seemed at first like a technical glitch. Periodic bursts of rapid, jerky movement beneath the closed eyelids occurring at intervals throughout the night rather than continuously, and accompanied by clear shifts in breathing and heart rate each time they appeared. Curious whether this was some quirk unique to infant physiology, Aserinsky eventually brought in his own 8-year-old son Armand, wired a few simple electrodes near his eyes in a borrowed room in the university's physiology department, and watched the same pattern repeat itself unmistakably in an older child's ordinary night of sleep. What followed was one of those rare moments in the history of science where a small, careful observation reorganizes an entire field almost overnight. Aserinsky and Kleitman went on to study adult subjects using the same method, waking sleepers at different points through the night to ask simply whether they had been dreaming. When woken during one of these bursts of rapid eye movement, subjects reported vivid, detailed dreams the overwhelming majority of the time. When woken during the quieter stretches of sleep in between, they very rarely did. Published together in the journal Science in 1953, their findings established for the first time in the documented history of medicine that sleep is not one undifferentiated state, but a structured cycling process, alternating through distinct stages across the night, each with its own particular signature of brain activity, and among those stages one in particular, later named rapid eye movement sleep, that appeared to be the stage in which the sleeping mind was doing something recognizably close to thinking just behind a closed and motionless door. It is worth sitting for a moment with how young this discovery actually is, set against everything this story has already traveled through. Human beings had been lying down beside fires, waking for their watch, in the deep of a medieval night, and later collapsing exhausted after a factory shift for the entire span of civilization, and long before it all, without a single documented understanding of what their own brain was actually doing during those unconscious hours. It took until the middle of the 20th century, and a piece of borrowed malfunctioning equipment in a university basement for that most basic and universal of human experiences to be seen clearly for the first time. There is something almost humbling in that, a reminder of how much of the ordinary architecture of a human life, the very thing every single listener to this story does without exception, every single night, remain genuinely mysterious to science until well within living memory. The stages. Aserinsky and Kleitman's work eventually helped map out, later refined and expanded by other researchers, including their own student. William Dement revealed a nightly rhythm considerably more intricate than the old flat idea of unconsciousness had ever suggested. A sleeper moves across a typical night through a sequence of progressively deeper stages, the body's temperature falling, muscles relaxing, brain activity slowing into the long, rolling waves associated with the deepest physical rest before cycling back upward into a lighter stage and finally into rapid eye movement sleep itself, a state so paradoxically active in its brainwave pattern that it's sometimes described even now as paradoxical sleep, the body as still and unresponsive as it will ever be, while the mind races through something close to waking thought. This entire cycle repeats several times across an ordinary night, each pass through the sequence slightly different from the last. The earlier cycles weighted more heavily toward the deep restorative stages. The later ones, closer to morning, weighted more heavily toward the vivid, dream-rich territory of rapid eye movement. Why the body would need this much internal complexity, this much careful architecture simply to rest remains a question the field has not fully answered even now, and honest researchers are careful to say so. Scholars still debate the precise function of rapid eye movement sleep, specifically with competing theories pointing toward its apparent role in consolidating emotional memory, in helping the brain process and file away the events of the previous day, in maintaining the health of the nervous system in ways not yet fully mapped, and in some more recent and still contested proposals in helping regulate mood and emotional resilience across waking life. No single explanation has been established as complete, and the evidence connecting each of these proposed functions to concrete measurable outcomes remains an active and sometimes contentious area of ongoing study. What researchers do largely agree on is smaller but still remarkable. That the brain during this stage of sleep is doing genuine structured work, not simply idling, and that depriving a person of it, selectively waking them each time the pattern begins without disturbing their other sleep, produces measurable effects on mood, memory, and clarity of thought the following day. Effects the person deprived only of ordinary sleep quantity does not show in quite the same way. This is in its own quiet way where the deep evolutionary story this video began with and the 20th century laboratory discovery finally meet each other. If early humans were sleeping in short, interrupted, only partially surrendered stretches tuned to the falling temperature of an open night and the low hum of possible danger somewhere beyond the fire, then whatever restorative work rapid eye movement, sleep, and its neighboring stages are actually accomplishing had to happen inside those same short broken windows, compressed and efficient in a way a modern 8-hour uninterrupted night was never strictly required to be. The body, across an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary time, appears to have learned how to pack essential neurological maintenance into whatever space the environment safely allowed, a kind of quiet, patient efficiency built directly into the deepest architecture of human rest. There is a certain grace in imagining Eugene Aserinsky alone in that borrowed basement room with his son's small still form, and a piece of salvaged equipment nobody else wanted, watching those first careful traces scroll across the page and slowly beginning to understand that sleep had been keeping a secret from the whole of human history, one that had nothing to do with absence at all. It is a discovery that reframes everything this story has already travelled through: the fires, the segmented medieval nights, the exhausted night shift workers, all of it now understood to be different chapters in the same much larger question, not simply how long humans have slept, but what their minds were quietly doing all along in the dark. That question of what exactly the sleeping brain is built to accomplish and how sharply that architecture differs from the sleeping minds of the animals humans share this planet with is where the story is about to turn next. There is a particular kind of nest built each evening by a creature far more closely related to us than most people ever stop to consider, and it turns out that nest holds one of the clearest clues we have to why human sleep looks so strangely different from that of every other primate on the planet. Chimpanzees, our nearest living relatives, do not simply lie down where they happen to be standing when night falls. Each evening, an individual chimpanzee climbs into the canopy and constructs with real care and no small amount of skill a springy woven platform of bent branches and folded leaves high enough above the forest floor to place real distance between itself and whatever might be moving through the undergrowth below. Gorillas do something similar. Orangutans too, and this behavior, called nest building, appears across every one of the great apes, closely enough related to us that researchers believe it likely describes something close to how our own distant ancestors were sleeping as well, tucked safely above the ground, night after night for a very long stretch of our shared evolutionary history. And then at some point along the human branch of that family tree, that pattern simply stopped. We came down out of the trees and we never went back up to sleep again. This single, seemingly small shift, the descent to sleeping on open ground, is at the center of one of the more compelling explanations currently offered for why human sleep looks so unusual compared to every other primate that has ever been carefully studied. An anthropologist named David Sampson, working for years alongside the evolutionary biologist Charles Nunn, spent well over a decade assembling and analyzing sleep data gathered across roughly 30 different primate species, everything from small nocturnal lemurs to full-grown gorillas, building statistical models sophisticated enough to predict based purely on a species' body size, brain size, diet, and typical environment roughly how many hours of sleep that species ought to need each day. When they finally ran the numbers for humans, the model predicted we should be sleeping somewhere close to 10.5 hours a night. The actual figure across nearly every culture ever measured sits closer to 7. Humans, by every reasonable evolutionary expectation built from our closest relatives, are chronically, almost bizarrely undersleeping and have very likely been doing so for a very long time. What makes this finding stranger still rather than simpler is what happens when researchers look past the raw number of hours and examine the actual internal structure of a human night. Humans do not just sleep less than the primate model predicts. We also devote a noticeably larger share of whatever sleep we do get to rapid eye movement, the dream-rich, cognitively active stage, first identified in that Chicago basement decades earlier than any other primate species measured, while the deep, slow-wave restorative stage known as non-rapid eye movement sleep has been compressed down to a surprisingly small portion of the night by comparison. It is, as Nunn himself has put it, a genuinely surprising result, one that suggests something had to give as human sleep grew shorter across our evolutionary history, and what gave overwhelmingly was not the dreaming, thinking stage of sleep, but the deep, quiet stage beneath it. Sampson and Nunn's proposed explanation for this pattern connects directly back to the earliest part of this very story. The woman lying near her fire on the open grassland only partly surrendering to unconsciousness, because full sleep once carried genuine risk. Once our ancestors abandoned the relative safety of a nest high in the canopy for the open ground below. They traded one danger for a different, arguably sharper one, no longer worried chiefly about falling, but newly exposed to every predator and every rival group capable of moving quietly across open terrain in the dark. Shorter, lighter, more easily interrupted sleep may have been the evolutionary price paid for that exposure. A nervous system perpetually primed to surface toward wakefulness, rather than sink completely away from it. But risk is only half of the proposed explanation, and the second half is in its own way even more striking. Sampson and Nunn argue that our ancestors were not merely losing sleep to danger, they were actively trading it away deliberately for something they valued more. Time, waking hours spent by a shared fire, teaching a child how to nap a stone tool, learning the layout of a new territory building, and repairing the social bonds that held a small vulnerable group together. Every hour spent in deep, restorative but cognitively idle, non-rapid eye movement sleep was an hour that could not be spent doing any of that, and across an almost unimaginable number of generations, the balance appears to have tipped again and again toward wakefulness and its opportunities right up until human sleep became the strange, efficient, dream-heavy compression it is today. It's worth being honest about how contested some of the finer details of this picture remain, because that honesty is part of what makes the story trustworthy, rather than merely tidy. The particular proportions Sampson and Nunn calculated depend heavily on the statistical models used to build them, and other researchers in the field continue to debate how precisely to weigh the relative contributions of predation risk against the more social cognitive explanation of traded time, and how confidently any of this can be extended backward across millions of years using data gathered from living species today. The fossil record itself offers almost nothing directly useful here, since sleep, unlike bone or tooth, leaves no physical trace behind for future scientists to uncover, which means every conclusion in this particular corner of the field is necessarily an inference built from comparison and modelling rather than direct ancient evidence. But even with those honest limits acknowledged, the broader shape of the finding has held up across multiple independent studies conducted a decade apart, and it offers something genuinely rare in this kind of research: a clear, testable, quantitative answer to a question that used to belong almost entirely to speculation. Is it strange to think that the very same trade our earliest ancestors were making around a fire nearly 200,000 years ago, choosing conversation and firelight and shared learning? Over another hour of deep, uninterrupted rest is one still being made quietly and mostly unconsciously by nearly everyone listening to this story right now. Each time the choice arrives to stay up a little later. For one more chapter, one more conversation, one more quiet hour before finally letting the day close. Perhaps it is not strange at all. Perhaps it is one of the oldest and most stubbornly persistent habits our species carries, older than agriculture, older than fire itself in its very earliest form, a preference written somewhere deep in the architecture of human sleep for squeezing a little more waking life out of every single night than strict biological caution would ever recommend. What that trade actually cost our ancestors, and what it may still be quietly costing every one of us now, is a question. This story is finally ready to turn toward directly, because the evidence for what happens when that ancient, careful balance tips too far in one direction has become in recent decades impossible for modern science to ignore. A small glass booth stood in the middle of Times Square in the winter of 1959, lit day and night, with a popular radio disc jockey named Peter Tripp sitting inside it, continuing to host his show for millions of listeners while the entire city watched him quite literally in a window display. He had agreed to stay awake for 200 hours, roughly 8.5 days, as a charity stunt for the March of Dimes, broadcasting the whole time in full public view. What began as a light-hearted publicity event slowly turned into something closer to an unplanned scientific case study, one that would end up teaching researchers more about the outer edges of human wakefulness than almost any deliberate experiment before it. For the first 2 or 3 days, Tripp seemed largely himself, cheerful, sharp, still capable of running his show with the easy charm his listeners knew. By the 3rd day, something had noticeably shifted. Friends and colleagues who visited the glass booth described a man growing irritable in a way entirely out of character, snapping at people he had known for years, his usual warmth replaced by something sharper and more brittle. By the later days of the stunt, the change had deepened further still. Tripp began seeing things that were not there: a spider crawling across his shoe that vanished when he reached for it, a small fire in a drawer of his desk that existed only in his exhausted mind. Toward the very end, he grew convinced that a doctor observing him was actually an undertaker come to bury him alive, and had to be gently talked down from the fear. He completed the full 200 hours and afterward slept for somewhere between 13 and 22 hours depending on which account you trust before slowly returning to something closer to his ordinary self. What happened to Peter Tripp afterward remains honestly a matter some historical uncertainty. Popular retellings of his story have long claimed that he suffered permanent personality changes following the stunter marriage that soon broke down a radio career that quietly unraveled over the following years. Some of that appears to be true, though careful biographical research suggests the causal thread connecting his later struggles directly back to those 8 sleepless days is considerably less certain than the popular version of the story implies. And William Dement, one of the researchers who monitored Tripp throughout the ordeal, later concluded that the hallucinations and paranoia were likely driven far more by a stimulant medication administered to him near the end of the stunt than by sleep loss on its own. It is a useful, honest correction to keep in mind, a reminder that even a story this dramatic deserves careful separation between what evidence actually shows and what simply makes for a better headline. That correction becomes especially important when set against what happened only 5 years later in the final days of 1963 in an ordinary San Diego household. A 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner, working on a science fair project with 2 classmates, decided to attempt a new record for the longest documented stretch without sleep, aiming past 260 hours, well over 11 full days. Aware of what had happened to Peter Tripp, Gardner made a quiet decision from the outset. No stimulant drugs of any kind, nothing beyond ordinary cola, loud music and occasional cold showers to help him push through the worst hours of drowsiness. Word of the attempt reached Stanford and William Dement himself. The same researcher who had monitored Tripp drove down to observe Gardner, directly curious whether the earlier case's psychiatric symptoms would repeat themselves in a young, healthy subject kept free of medication. They largely did not. Gardner grew slower, more irritable, occasionally unable to complete simple mental tasks as the days wore on, and by his own account struggled at times to keep his thoughts organized. But the vivid hallucinations and genuine paranoia that mark Tripp's final days never appeared in anything close to the same severity. Dement would later walk back his earlier, more alarmed conclusions about sleep deprivation reliably causing psychosis, stating plainly that Gardner's 11 days without sleep had not produced any lasting psychiatric harm that careful, sustained observation could do. The comparison between these 2 cases, separated by only half a decade, offers something genuinely valuable, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It suggests that some of what looks at first glance like the direct cost of sleep loss may actually be something more tangled, shaped by stimulants, by the pressure of public performance, by individual variation in how different nervous systems respond to strain. Scholars in the field still debate exactly how to separate pure sleep deprivation from these confounding factors even now, and modern research ethics committees no longer permit experiments anywhere near this extreme, precisely because the risks, whatever their exact source, are considered too significant to justify. Guinness World Records itself stopped certifying new wakefulness records decades ago, for that same reason, unwilling to encourage anyone toward Gardner's 11 days again. And yet, for all that necessary caution, the accumulated body of far more modest, carefully controlled sleep research conducted since Tripp and Gardner's era has confirmed something neither of their individual stories could prove on its own, that the cost of insufficient sleep even far short of 11 days is real, measurable, and remarkably consistent from one person to the next. Reaction time slows in ways nearly identical to functional intoxication. Emotional regulation frays, with the brain's threat detecting centers growing measurably more reactive to minor frustrations after even a single significantly shortened night. Memory consolidation, the very process researchers had begun to glimpse in the rapid eye movement discoveries decades earlier, grows noticeably less reliable. None of this required 11 sleepless days to demonstrate. It shows up subtly but consistently after the kind of ordinary, remarkable sleep loss that so many people simply accept as the price of a demanding week, a late deadline, a restless night before an early flight. There is something worth pausing on here, a kind of quiet mercy hidden inside all this hard data. If Peter Tripp and Randy Gardner's stories teach anything with real confidence, it is that the human body and mind, for all their vulnerability to sleep loss, are also remarkably resilient, capable of stumbling through genuinely extreme deprivation, and in most cases finding their way back to steadiness once real rest finally returns. The deeper danger the science increasingly suggests may lie less in the occasional sleepless night which every human being since the earliest fires has surely experienced at one time or another, and more in something quieter and far more sustained, the slow chronic shortfall that has come to define ordinary life for millions of people living now, long after Tripp stepped out of his glass booth and Gardner finally closed his eyes. What that longer, quieter cost actually looks like, and what it means for the billions of people currently living further from natural darkness than any generation in the history of our species, is where this story turns next. A little more than a month is all it took once every last trace of artificial light had been carefully removed from a small group of volunteers' evenings for something ancient to quietly resurface in their bodies without any of them being told to expect it. The researcher behind this particular study was Thomas Ware, working through the early 1990s at the National Institute of Mental Health, and his question was a deceptively simple one. If Roger Eckert's historical detective work was right, and if segmented sleep really had been the ordinary shape of a pre-industrial night, then perhaps it was not some outdated cultural habit at all, but a genuine biological default, one that had simply been buried under more than a century of electric light. The only way to know for certain was to recreate in a controlled laboratory setting the kind of long dark winter night a person living several centuries earlier would have experienced, and then simply watch what the body decided to do with all that unfilled darkness. Ware took a small group of healthy men and for a full month confined them each evening to 14 hours of complete darkness, roughly the length of a winter night at higher latitudes in Europe or North America. The same stretch of darkness Eckertz had found woven so consistently through those centuries of English and French court records. During the day the volunteers lived under ordinary light, but once evening fell there was nothing left to fill the hours. No lamp, no page to read, no glowing screen, only the same total undifferentiated dark that a farmhouse in 17th century England would have known each night once the last candle was extinguished. Ware let his volunteers sleep exactly as much and as little as their bodies wanted, imposing no schedule at all beyond the boundary of darkness itself, and then simply waited to see what would happen. What happened first was not especially surprising. On the earliest nights of the experiment, the volunteers slept for roughly 11 hours straight, a long, deep, almost desperate stretch of rest that researchers interpreted as the body finally repaying some portion of a sleep debt most modern people carry quietly for years without ever fully noticing it. But it was what happened next as the weeks progressed that made Ware's study genuinely remarkable. By the fourth week, that long undifferentiated block of sleep had reorganized itself, settling into something startlingly specific and startlingly familiar. The volunteers began falling asleep quickly for a first stretch lasting roughly 3 to 5 hours, then waking calmly and without distress for an interval of quiet, restful wakefulness, lasting an hour or two before drifting into a second 3 to 5 hour stretch of sleep that carried them through to morning. Total sleep time settled at close to 8 hours a night, almost exactly matching modern medical guidelines, but divided cleanly into the two segments Ekirch had traced through more than 2,000 historical documents, the very pattern the phrase first sleep had been quietly describing all along. The hormonal evidence Ware gathered alongside this behavioral shift made the connection even harder to dismiss as coincidence. He found that the onset of that first sleep period lined up closely with a measurable rise in melatonin, the same hormone released by the pineal gland in response to darkness that later research would connect directly to the disruptive effects of electric and blue spectrum light. And the quiet waking period between the two sleep segments did not resemble anything close to ordinary insomnia, the anxious clock-watching wakefulness so many modern people associate with the middle of the night. Later researchers studying similar protocols would describe this interval as something closer to a calm, almost meditative state. Unhurried and unafraid, the hormonal signature of a mind at ease rather than a mind in distress. A striking physiological echo of exactly what those 17th century sources had described when they wrote of quiet prayer or unhurried conversation or simply lying still and thinking during the hour after first sleep. It would be an overstatement to claim Ware's study settled the entire question once and for all, and the honest record of how his findings have been received over the following decades reflects real ongoing debate rather than universal agreement. Other sleep researchers, including some of Ware's own contemporaries, have pointed out that 14 hours of total uninterrupted darkness is itself a fairly extreme and artificial condition, one that few people in any era likely experienced with such absolute consistency even before electric light existed, since firelight, moonlight, and simple household activity would have softened the edges of even the darkest pre-industrial winter night. Some scholars have also raised a more specific question about geography, noting that segmented sleep, both in Ekirch's historical sources and in Ware's laboratory recreation, may be less a universal human default and more a specific adaptation to the unusually long winter nights of higher latitude regions. A pattern that might look quite different for populations living closer to the equator, where the night rarely stretches anywhere near 14 hours even in the depths of winter. The evidence connecting Ware's laboratory findings directly and precisely to Ekirch's historical record remains, by the admission of researchers working in the field today, suggestive rather than conclusively proven two independent lines of investigation that point toward the same striking pattern without yet being fully formally reconciled. What the study does establish with real confidence, regardless of exactly how it connects to the deeper historical record, is something quietly significant on its own. Segmented sleep is not simply a relic that vanished along with candlelight and horse-drawn carriages, a historical curiosity confined permanently to old court documents and monastery prayer schedules. It is a pattern the human body appears fully capable of producing again on its own, without instruction, the moment it is given back the kind of long, undisturbed darkness it likely experienced for the greater part of the human history. The body, in other words, did not forget, it simply stopped being asked. Which raises a quieter, more personal question. Underneath all the laboratory data, this story has been circling since its very first fire, beside its very first careful sleeper on the open grassland so long ago. If darkness itself is capable of coaxing this old patient rhythm back to the surface after only a month, what does it mean that so few people anywhere in the modern world ever actually get the chance to find out, surrounded as nearly everyone now is by screen street lights and the low electric glow that never quite lets true darkness back into the room? That question of what has been quietly lost and what, if anything, might still be recovered from it is where this long night of history is finally ready to come to its rest. There is a particular image we society worth returning to now. This story has carried quietly since its very beginning. A body lying near a small fire tens of thousands of years ago, On open ground, somewhere in what is now northern Tanzania, not fully asleep and not fully awake, caught in that old careful middle state that kept a species alive through nights with no walls and no locks, and no promise of safety beyond the reach of the flames. Everything this story has travelled through since then, the segmented nights of medieval households, the glow of Edison's bulbs spreading through factory floors and family parlours, the tired eyes of night shift workers at 3 Mile Island, the strange dreaming mind first glimpsed through a broken piece of equipment in a University of Chicago basement. All of it descends in one way or another from that same original unresolved bargain between rest and vigilance. We have never fully closed that account. We have only kept renegotiating its terms, generation after generation, using whatever tools each era happened to have. What is easy to miss? Looking back across everything this story has covered is how consistently the evidence points away from a simple story of decline. It would be comforting in a certain way to believe that early humans possessed some pure, untroubled relationship with sleep that industrial life later corrupted. That somewhere in our past there existed a golden age of rest. We have since forfeited through screens and streetlights and the relentless demands of modern schedules. The data does not support that story, and honesty requires saying so plainly, even here, even now. The Hadza, the San, and the Tsiman living lives about as close to our ancestral condition as any humans alive today, sleep no more than we do, and by some measures sleep a little less. Our earliest ancestors were not sleeping long, easy, unbroken nights beneath open skies. They were doing something more careful, more responsive, more attuned to danger and temperature and the low crackle of a fire that needed tending, a nightly negotiation shaped as much by risk as by rest. And yet something real was still lost, even if the losing did not happen the way popular imagination usually tells it. What Roger Eckertz found buried in centuries of court records and medical texts, what Thomas Ware recovered in a small group of volunteers given back their darkness for a single month, was not a longer or deeper sleep than we manage today. It was a different relationship with the hours a sleeping body spends unaccounted for. A watch between two sleeps that carried no anxiety in it. A waking in the middle of the night that was not failure, was not a problem requiring a name and a treatment, but simply an ordinary, expected, even quietly valuable part of how a night unfolded. That relationship, more than any particular number of hours, is what electric light and industrial scheduling and the medicalization of ordinary wakefulness slowly dismantled over the span of only a few generations. So thoroughly that by the time serious sleep science finally arrived, almost nobody remembered there had ever been another way to think about a 3 a.m. waking at all. There is a kind of humility worth sitting with in how recently we actually came to understand any of this. Human beings have been sleeping every single night since long before there were humans in any modern sense at all, and it took until 1953 until a graduate student's own 8-year-old son lay down with a few borrowed electrodes near his eyes for science to finally see that sleep was not an absence but an architecture layered and active and doing quiet, essential work behind closed lids the entire time. It took until the 1990s for anyone to place volunteers back into real darkness, long enough to watch an old buried rhythm rise back to the surface on its own. The most ordinary act any of us perform, something every single person listening to this story is likely to do again within a few hours of hearing it remained genuinely mysterious to the species practicing it for the overwhelming majority of our shared history. We are, in this one very particular sense, still new to understanding ourselves. That newness connects to something larger. This story has quietly been circling from its very first minutes, a pattern that shows up again and again across the long arc of human history whenever people try to reckon honestly with the past. Power looks permanent while it holds, and then it does not. A city looks eternal while its lights burn, and then the lights go out, and the city becomes an old story told by someone else's descendants. And a way of living, a rhythm as intimate and unquestioned as how a person spends the hours between one sunset and the next, can feel like the only possible way of being human, right up until it is quietly and almost invisibly replaced by something else entirely, so completely that within a single lifetime the old way disappears from memory as if it had never existed at all. Segmented sleep did not end in a war or a plague, or a single dramatic event anyone thought to record with the weight it deserved. It simply thinned out generation by generation, candle by candle, street lamp by street lamp, until the last person who remembered the phrase first sleep as an ordinary part of language died sometime in the early 1800s, almost certainly without any sense that something worth preserving was slipping away with them. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the oldest and most human patterns there is. Not collapse, not catastrophe, but forgetting. The slow erosion of something that once felt as solid and permanent as the ground itself, worn away not by violence but by convenience, by comfort, by the simple accumulation of small changes that nobody at the time thought to call a loss. It happened to segmented sleep. It has happened to countless other quiet inheritances across the long span of human history. Skills and rhythms and understanding once considered, too basic to ever require deliberate remembering, gone now, recoverable only through the patient, unglamorous work of historians and scientists willing to sift through old court records and glacier caves and darkened laboratory rooms to find the traces left behind. But here is the piece of evidence worth carrying forward from everything this story has gathered, the detail that crystallizes what all of it actually means. When Thomas Ware took his small group of ordinary volunteers and simply gave them back their darkness, nothing more dramatic than that the ancient rhythm did not need to be taught to them. It did not need to be explained or coaxed, or painstakingly reconstructed from historical texts. It came back on its own quietly, within a matter of weeks, exactly as it must have arrived unbidden in every human body for tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. The body remembered. Whatever the mind forgets, whatever the culture stops naming, whatever slips quietly out of language and record and collective memory, something older and steadier inside every one of us appears to still be listening for the conditions it was built to expect. It has been waiting patiently the entire time for the dark to be given back to it. That is worth carrying with you now as this story comes to its close. Not as an instruction, not as something you need to fix or change or optimize before tomorrow. Simply as a quiet fact to hold the way you might hold a small stone smoothed by a very long river worn down by more time than the mind can easily picture. Somewhere behind every ordinary night, in every closed eye and every drifting thought, an old rhythm is still keeping its own quiet watch. It kept watch beside the first fires on the open grassland. It kept watch through the long, dark winters of medieval households in the hour between one sleep and the next, when someone lay quietly beside another person and simply talked, or prayed, or watched the last embers settle into ash. It kept watch through the wake-athons and the glass booths, and the fluorescent hum of control rooms built for a schedule the body never fully agreed to. And it is keeping watch now tonight in you, however far your evening has carried you from the conditions it was shaped by. History was never really about what we built. It was about what carried us through the building of it, the fires we tended, the watches we kept for each other, the quiet hour we did not know we were allowed to want back. Somewhere a fire is still burning low, and somewhere in you, something very old is finally gently letting go.